Yeah, so Lindsay, thank you very much for having me. Delighted to be with all of you. It's wonderful that you have such a wonderful clinician and an advocate and an educator in Lindsay. It's people like you who will change the course of this disease. And as Lindsay indicated, I think Parkinson's is largely a man-made disease. There are extraordinarily few ancient descriptions of the disease, and the first major description of the disease didn't occur until 1817 when a 61-year-old British surgeon named Dr. James Parkinson saw something new on the streets of London. And what he saw that was new wasn't just a tremor, but people with a tremor, a stoop posture, a tendency to walk faster and faster and to fall forward. And he wrote an essay on six people with the disease. They were all older, all north of 50, and likely all men. And he said this disease has not been classified in the medical literature. He thought he was describing something new. And he describes this in 1817. 200 years later, the Global Burden of Disease study estimates that 6 million people had the disease. So how do you go from something new affecting six people in 1817 to something affecting 6 million people in 2017? Well, it can't be genetics. You all know that the genes don't change that fast. It's growing much faster than aging alone can explain. It must be in our environment. And I think there are three major environmental causes or risk factors for the disease. One, as Lindsay suggested, are pesticides, Agent Orange, paraquat, rotenone, pyrethrin, some of the pesticides that are likely in your garages or in your homes today. Second is our dry cleaning chemicals, including this chemical called trichloroethylene. All of you know that water is made up of three atoms, is H2O. Trichloroethylene is made up of a whopping six, two carbons in black, one hydrogen in white, and three chlorines in green, hence its name trichloroethylene. This is the same chemical that's contaminated the marine base Camp Lejeune, which many of you heard of. This contaminated El Toro base in Southern California and many, many military bases around the country and around the world. It and a close cousin, perchloroethylene, which has just four chlorine atoms, I think actually the principal causes of Parkinson's in the US. If you've dry cleaned your clothes, you've been likely exposed to perchloroethylene. If you use typewriter correction fluid, gun cleaner, carpet cleaner, if you're a printer, if you're a painter, if you worked in embalming, if you were a mechanic, if you worked cleaning in the electronics industry, if you worked in Silicon Valley, you were likely exposed or possibly exposed to these chemicals. And the third is air pollution. So certain pesticides, industrial chemicals, especially degreasing and dry cleaning chemicals, all this for dry cleaning, and air pollution, I think, are the three major environmental causes of the disease. Oh, and then what can you do? So we're coming out with a second book called The Parkinson's Plan, and I'm going to give you a preview. Can I share my screen, Lindsay? So just like if a smoker gets diagnosed with lung cancer, what's the first thing the doctor's going to tell them to do?
Stop smoking.
But when you were diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, what did the doctor tell you to do?
Exercise.
Oh, good. So good. You got that. So that's one of the 25 things you can do. I say the first thing, the exercise might win. The other thing you should do is stop getting exposed to these toxicants. So if you're getting exposed to certain pesticides, if you're getting exposed to these dry cleaning chemicals, if you're getting exposed to air pollution, why not stop getting exposed to it? Still just waiting to share my screen. And I'll show you just briefly 25 ways that people with Parkinson's disease, there are 25 ways people without Parkinson's actions that people can take to reduce their risk of the disease. And I think for people with the disease, these 25 things might be even more important.
Should be able to share your screen now.
Okay, perfect. So I'll give you a little brief preview. The publisher probably kill me, but it's coming to you. We wrote this book for you anyway. So can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
So this is the Parkinson's 25 things that you can do in your everyday life to lower your risk of Parkinson's. And as the picture suggests, buying organic produce, washing all your produce, avoiding dry cleaning, using a water filter. I don't know if you guys saw a new chemical was found in the water supply for over 100 million Americans today. I haven't read in great detail, but I have a carbon filter for my water at home. sleeping well. If I lived in Southern California, I would have an air purifier. I mentioned air pollution as a major risk factor. You can put an air purifier in your bedroom and in your kitchen. If you drive through polluted traffic on the 405 freeway, I would roll up my windows and recirculate my air. I'd be very, very mindful of chemicals and avoid having chemicals sprayed on my yard. I'd be concerned if I lived near a golf course that was using pesticides. And I would be concerned, I would be cautious in dry cleaning and use a dry cleaning company that doesn't use perchloroethylene, or also called PERC, in the industry. So I think there are lots and lots of things that individuals can do to alter the course. But fundamentally, our environment is a product of decisions that we make as communities. It'd be nice if we stopped using pesticides on schools. California has largely done that. But most parts of the country, we spray pesticides on kids' playgrounds, on their soccer fields, and kids are absorbing and breathing in these chemicals. And then I think we need to, at a societal level, get rid of pesticides. China has banned paraquat, which is a weed killer. It kills the weeds that Roundup doesn't. It's sprayed up and down the Central Valley of
Because
California, and it's associated with a 150% increased risk of Parkinson's.
if it's sitting in the garage. Like,
Exactly. I can't either.
I mean,
So if I could ask everybody to mute your microphone unless you do have a question that you'd like to ask, right? Okay, I have some other questions, but does anybody here have anything on their mind that they'd like to ask? Yes.
More immediate questions, I'm sorry to say, but I do, this is very shocking to me. My husband was a police officer for 30 years. And they dry clean their uniforms every day, every single day. They never stopped dry cleaning uniforms for 30 years. But we also think that possibly is genetic. And the question I wanted to ask you, and I know that I went to the Michael J. Fox presentation recently. And when I mentioned the fact of essential tremor, they kind of shut me down really fast and said, that's not Parkinson's. But we have 3 generations right in front of me, my husband, my son, and my grandson, who all have the essential tremor. And my husband has Parkinson's. So there's a big concern there about the hereditary nature. And what I see just around me is a lot of people who do have Parkinson's that I've spoken to. I've been told anywhere between 10 and 20% of the people with essential tremor get Parkinson's. I don't know whether you want to discuss this or just leave it.
Can you say the first part about the dry cleaner?
30 years of uniforms being dry cleaned. My husband did that. He's
and then he developed Parkinson's?
Yes, he probably
Okay.
probably the usual, like when he was in his 50s, that I look back, there were symptoms. So wasn't diagnosed till he was 68 or 69.
So let's do essential tremor and then we'll do dry cleaning. So essential tremor runs in families, likely has a strong heritable component to it. As opposed to Parkinson's, Parkinson's is primarily a tremor at rest. Essential tremor is primarily a tremor with action. Most notable, like for example, someone eating soup or drinking soup or bringing a glass of water to their mouth. And indeed, as you suggest, that individuals with essential tremor appear to be at higher risk for Parkinson's disease. Second thing you asked was genetic. So there are a lot of people. How many people carry genetic cause for Parkinson's disease?
We haven't been diagnosed with that, but.
So it turns out there's a study but they've been done by the Parkinson's Foundation called PD Generation. They've tested thousands of people with Parkinson's disease who signed up to participate in the study. 13% of people carry a genetic risk factor. So said another way, 87% of people, the overwhelming majority of people with Parkinson's disease have nothing to do with any known genetic risk factor or genetic cause for the disease. By contrast, let's talk about dry cleaning. So there was a small study that looked at, in Europe, that looked at what was causing Parkinson's disease. And they looked at a whole range of industries, mechanics, retail, accountants, and the list went on and on. The number one occupation tied to Parkinson's disease was dry cleaning. It had a 15-fold, 15 times increased risk for developing Parkinson's disease. Now, it was a small study, but that was the highest risk of any occupation. So, most of these chemicals are inhaled or ingested, swallowed. Many of them are known to damage the energy producing parts of cells that we know are damaged in Parkinson's disease. And trichloroethylene, widely used in dry cleaning from 1930s to 1950s in the US until perchloroethylene was used in the 1950s. One study suggested that these are at 500% increased risk of developing Parkinson's disease. This chemical is a known to cause cancer, according to the World Health Organization, the EPA, Department of Health and Human Services, causes cancer, and this likely causes cancer. And so these are the chemicals that are at Camp Lejeune that was contaminated in part by a dry cleaner that inappropriately disposed of the chemicals it used to clean uniforms of officers at Camp Lejeune. We're paying a very, very, very high price so that our clothes don't shrink.
Great. So you had also mentioned that even if you live near a dry cleaner, or you live above a dry cleaner, or does in a neighborhood where there is a dry cleaner, that those chemicals can seep into the groundwater and end up in your home, in your indoor environment. And can you kind of go off on that?
Yeah, so many of you have been in New York City and in East Coast cities, and there are high rises, and those high rises, apartment buildings often used to have dry cleaners on the ground floor of them, right? And then it turns out that trichloroethylene, perchloroethylene, especially perchloroethylene, evaporates. Both the chemicals evaporate. Perchloroethylene, more commonly used in dry cleaning today, evaporates. And so they did a study in New York City and in Albany, and they tested the indoor air of the apartments above the dry cleaners. And in many, I think 24 of the 27 apartments, they found that the level of perchloroethylene in the indoor air of apartments simply above a dry cleaner was at unsafe levels, at sometimes 30 times levels that were to be safe. Also, as I mentioned, these chemicals dissolve in fat, and so when you opened the refrigerator door and you looked at the butter and the cheese in the refrigerator, you found perchloroethylene in the butter and the cheese. And this isn't just in the United States. In Germany, they have looked at supermarket grocery stores that are simply located near a dry cleaner, and they can find the dry cleaning chemicals in the dairy products in grocery stores in Germany. As mentioned, I did my training in Philadelphia, and I used to live in an apartment building above a dry cleaner, so I didn't know any of this in medical school. It was never taught to me as far as I can recall. And then so I called them up, 30 years after the fact. And fortunately, I was told that they were just a storefront for the dry cleaning. The dry cleaning was actually done off-site. But even future neurologists, Parkinson's specialists could have been exposed to these dry cleaning chemicals without even knowing it.
Now, the EPA has banned, my understanding is that they have banned trichloroethylene, but that they are allowing companies about a year to get that out of their production lines or to get it out of their systems and out of use. But, that's giving a whole other year where this can spread into the environment.
Yeah, so my understanding is if pros ban, if it's actually been banned, fantastic. California has banned perchloroethylene, so you can't, in dry cleaning in California, you should not be being exposed to this anymore. So this is good, right? Future generations are all applauding this decision. There's going to be less cancer because of this decision. There's going to be less Parkinson's disease because of this decision. Unfortunately, there are thousands of contaminated sites throughout the United States. Over half of Superfund sites, the most toxic sites in the country, are contaminated with trichloroethylene and or perchloroethylene. And those sites are in Southern California. They are located less than a half mile from where I went to high school in Corona Del Mar, at Corona Del Mar High School in Orange County. So there are lots and lots of these contaminated sites, and we need to protect it. One, people need to be made aware that they are living near these sites or going to school near these sites or working near these sites. And two, we need to take actions to remediate, prevent people from getting exposed to these chemicals, which is relatively easy to do. And then three, we need to clean it up.
What about Roundup in California? It hasn't been banned yet, right?
So Roundup, yeah, is glyphosate. I don't think it plays a major role in Parkinson's disease. There are lawsuits and stuff about its role in cancer. But if you just step back, listen, cancer rates among Americans under 50 is rising. So cancer in the United States among people under 50 is rising. Why is that? Well, if it's under 50, it's unlikely to be changes in genetics over, again, short periods of time. Two, it's unlikely to be diagnosis because we generally don't screen people for cancer until age 50. So it has to be chemicals in our environment. So I think chemicals in our food, water, and air are fueling the rise of Parkinson's disease. And I think some of these same chemicals in our food, water, and air are contributing to the rise of cancer. If I ask you a simple question, what causes breast cancer, which affects 1 in 8 women, likely someone in this audience, what would you say causes breast cancer? Exactly. Isn't that a little concerning that we got pink ribbons going on everywhere? We got NFL players wearing all this. We got all these great campaigns, and no one can tell us what causes breast cancer.
Is it hereditary?
It's less heritable than Parkinson's disease. Only 10% of people carry a mutation in a gene called BRCA1 or BRCA2. 90% do not. We can't even answer basic questions about what causes breast cancer, what causes prostate cancer, 1 in 8 men, what's causing Parkinson's disease. And yet we had the audacity, and I think even the arrogance, to think that we're going to cure these diseases. Name me a disease that we can cure where we don't know its cause.
Well, this brings to mind a patient that comes here frequently for our speech therapy group who asked me, why is it that this all started with me not being able to smell anymore? I wasn't able to taste or smell anymore. And that seems to be a very common early sign. And also another common early sign is constipation for many, many, many years. So thinking about like the underlying causes and finding the root causes of diseases and illnesses. Is there any connection, do you think, with the damage to our mitochondria, the gut-brain connection, these difficulties with taste and smell early on, many, many years before diagnoses?
Yeah, so great question. So loss of smell and constipation are two of the earliest features of the disease. So in 2003, a really smart German pathologist named Heiko Brack postulated that Parkinson's disease, widely considered a brain disease, had its origins outside of the brain. So in 2003, this German pathologist said, hey, Parkinson's disease doesn't begin in the brain. When I look at the brains of people with Parkinson's disease, I see the pathology of Parkinson's disease, misfolded alpha-synuclein Lewy bodies, first in either the smell center, fancy term is the olfactory bulb, or in cells of a nerve called the vagus nerve that goes from the brainstem, from like right about here, all the way down to the gut. And then many of you remember polio, and it turns out that polio replicates as a virus that comes in through our gut, and then it goes up into our nerves and causes paralysis. And he wanted to know, Heiko Brack said, is Parkinson's disease due to neuroinvasion, perhaps from a virus that enters in through our gut and then travels up the vagus nerve all the way up to the brainstem, and then from there spreads up. In 2019, a really, really smart Dutch researcher named Per Borghammer postulated that there are two forms of Parkinson's disease. He said there is a body-first form of Parkinson's disease that begins, as Heiko Brack suggested, in the gut, and that there is a brain-first form of Parkinson's disease that begins in the olfactory bulb and then spreads to the part of the brain called the substantia nigra, which is affected in Parkinson's disease. So two forms of Parkinson's disease, one beginning in the gut, one beginning in the nose, one called body first, one called brain first. And so a year or 2 years ago, I contacted him and said, this is brilliant. What do you think about marrying this model with environmental exposures that are either ingested, for example, drinking polluted water from well water, for example, which is often contaminated with pesticides, leading to a gut first form or body first form of the disease, and inhaling chemicals like dry cleaning chemicals, leading to more of a brain or nose first model of the disease. And so we actually wrote a paper postulating exactly that, and that the form that begins in the gut leads to early constipation was one of the symptoms of the disease, happening years, if not decades, before someone develops the classic tremor and slowness of movement, and perhaps loss of smell being one of the earliest features of a brain first or nose first form of the disease.
There's a couple of questions here from the people joining by Zoom. First question by Nancy. Hello, we live in an area that has mine tailings. Sorry. I have allergies, sorry. We live in an area that has mine tailings in Colorado. Could that contribute to my PD diagnoses?
What's mine tailing?
Tailings.
Tailings?
Yes.
Mine tailings?
Yes.
Can you explain?
Oh, sorry. Maybe I spelled it wrong, but it's there's a very large silver mine that is about a quarter of a mile from our house. And at one point, when they mined the silver, they just dumped the water into the ground. This was in the 1800s.
So the person who deserves the most credit for figuring out the environmental causes of Parkinson's disease is a woman named Dr. Caroline Tanner, and she's a neurologist and an epidemiologist. You know, she's not only trained like a Parkinson's specialist, but has a PhD in epidemiology from Berkeley. She's now at UC San Francisco. And she has shown that minors have 4 times the risk of developing Parkinson's disease. I think they're inhaling metals, for example. If you want a little vignette, so Pope John Paul II, as many of you know, had Parkinson's or a form of Parkinson's disease. And you know, how would a pope be getting Parkinson's disease? Well, it turned out during World War II, Germany occupies Poland. Pope John Paul II is Polish. And all young men were forced to work in a labor camp. And he was sent into a mine in Poland, deep down into the ground, in a mine that's rich with manganese, a metal that's been linked to Parkinson's or a form of Parkinson's disease. So definitely minors would be at increased risk. There's also studies suggesting that heavy metals put people at increased risk for the disease. I'm a little just less certain, a little ignorant as opposed to drinking in these metals. I would be more concerned about inhaling them. But there are other chemicals that are widely used in mining that, for example, could be contaminated. It wouldn't surprise me at all if trichloroethylene was one of those. So those are some thoughts. I'd have to do more digging, and no pun intended, to get to the root of it.
Okay, thank you. Could you spell the name of the woman at UCSF?
Yeah, I'll put it out. If I put it in the chat, does that work for everyone?
That'd be great. Thank you.
Oops, UCSF.
I have a few questions from Jay Hershey, I believe is the spelling. Okay, so can having your shirts in your closet from a dry cleaner possibly increase your risk? And I guess this goes with your question. And when does the new book come out?
So the new book is called The Parkinson's Plan. It's coming out in August. And so I used to think just regular dry cleaning couldn't cause Parkinson's disease. And then I got 2 vignettes that made me reconsider. One is some woman told me that her husband worked every day in a blue-collar job in a factory, and he had to wear a dry clean shirt every single day of his life for 30 years, and then developed Parkinson's disease. And second, I saw a woman who lived in a 1-bedroom apartment in Boston, and evidently loved having clean environment, and would have 50 dry cleaned items hanging in her apartment. Her boyfriend said when she came over, it smelled like a dry cleaner. So I think yes. I think no one's bothered to study these questions, which is one of the major problems. It turns out when you pick up your dry cleaning, you put it in your car, the clothes off gas dry cleaning, so you'll be breathing in perchloroethylene likely on your way home. When you bring it into your house, you'll then be bringing it into your indoor air. So if I got dry cleaning in California, hopefully you shouldn't be getting perchloroethylene, but if I were worried, I would air out my dry cleaning like outside or in the garage before bringing it into the home. And if I had Parkinson's disease, and 60% of my nerve cells, many of you know that by the time you're diagnosed with Parkinson's, 60% of your nerve cells that produce dopamine are lost, I would do everything in my power to protect the remaining 40%. So I would exercise to release growth factors to protect them, and I'd avoid all these toxins like perchloroethylene, like dry cleaning chemicals, and pesticides like the plague, and air pollution.
Another question that is mentioned actually brings up something that you had mentioned in a previous talk I listened to about evidence of Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's types of brain changes showing up in the brains and blood of very young children. as young as 11 months old. Is that true? And then also, somebody's asking about their 6-year-old's little league, and they go like 2 to 3 times a week, you know, thinking about the grass that they play on. One of the coaches was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, and if there's any correlation there with like where kids play.
Yeah, so kind of crazy that we're spraying chemicals on kids' soccer fields so they don't play among the weeds. Let them play among the weeds. Why expose them to nerve toxins? There are multiple studies that have linked soccer playing to ALS, to Lou Gehrig's disease. I think because people are breathing in the chemicals, they're repeated head trauma, and I think they're absorbing these pesticides, but are nerve toxins. They're absorbing these nerve toxins through their skin and through their fat. Many of these nerve toxins are fat soluble. Many of these are also linked to cancer. So if we want to prevent Parkinson's disease, if we want to prevent ALS, if we want to prevent cancer for our children, you know, which is our responsibility to do so, we should ban pesticides on playgrounds and schools. And there are numerous studies. I mean, you see ALS common among football players. You see Parkinson's disease among coaches and football players. And I think there's reasons for that. And we should remember diseases have reasons. Diseases aren't just, except for getting struck by lightning, by and large, diseases have reasons. And we should, as doctors and scientists, figure out what those reasons are so we can prevent people from getting them. Now, what about early exposure? Well, I didn't really say it. Parkinson's disease unfolds over decades, if not generations. I personally think, and I think the evidence suggests, that's early childhood exposure that's really, really relevant to who develops these diseases and who doesn't. So if you don't want your kids or grandkids to get Parkinson's disease, avoid pesticides, avoid these chemicals, put water filters on your water, and avoid air pollution. In the 1990s, early 1990s, the most polluted city in the world was Mexico City. And there, a young woman, actually a girl, 16 years old, went to medical school. Her name was Lilian Calderon Garcia Duenas, and she was worried about the effects of air pollution on the brains of individuals in her country. And she did a crazy study. She looked at the brains of children and young adults who died prematurely, either from gun violence or car accidents in Mexico City. She looked at 203 brains, and 202 of those 203 brains, ages 11 months to 40 years old, she found Alzheimer's pathology. Alzheimer's pathology in 99% of brains beginning as early as 11 months of age up to 40. Of course, none of these individuals had Alzheimer's disease. They were too young to develop the disease, but they had the seeds of the disease in 99% of cases. And in over 20% of cases, they had the pathology of misfolded alpha-synuclein, the protein that's misfolded in Parkinson's disease. So I think in many cases, the seeds of the disease are planted at a young age. Her research suggests as early as 11 months of age. I wouldn't be surprised if it even began in utero.
That's just eye-opening. So there is somebody also asking about how important organic produce is and about the types of meat and you know, that we bring home, and making sure that those sources of meat are sourced in a clean, environmentally friendly way. How important is that as a key to preventing Parkinson's disease?
Yeah, so before I had the gift of a sabbatical in like 2017, when I read all of Dr. Tanner's work, I used to think that the air we breathe, the food we eat, and the water we drink were all clean and safe. I no longer believe that. And so I buy organic produce. I wash all my fruits and vegetables with water and soap. Turns out there may be water may be sufficient. I use water and soap because some of these pesticides are fat soluble. I became a vegetarian, or I don't eat meat, about 8 years ago because I read the book Fast Food Nation, which talked about the industrial killing of animals. They would line up cows in a line and they put a bullet through their heads so that we could get burgers. And it turns out that animals concentrate these toxins, many of them toxins, in their fat as they make their way up the food chain. So again, Dr. Tanner and her colleagues saw this happen in Hawaii, where the Pineapple Growers Association in Hawaii petitioned to have an exemption to use a pesticide that's especially dangerous one called heptachlor that's closely related to DDT. They wanted to protect their cash crop pineapples. They protected their cash crop, but then they sprayed the leafy parts of the pineapples with the pesticides as well, and they then fed those to the cows. And heptachlor is fat soluble, just like DDT, and it concentrated in the milk of the cows, and that milk made its way into dairies in Hawaii. That eventually led to a recall of milk in Hawaii. Dr. Tanner and her colleagues looked and studied and found out that people in Hawaii who had high milk consumption had higher rates of Parkinson's disease. When they looked at their brains after they died, they had fewer dopaminergic neurons, dopamine-producing nerve cells in their brain, and they found the residue of the pesticide in the brains of individuals with Parkinson's disease who drank lots of milk.
And there is somebody also asking if there's any connection between the use of prednisone or long-term use of prednisone, or I guess short-term, causing Parkinson's disease that you know of.
I'm unaware of any link between use of prednisone or steroids and Parkinson's disease.
Another question I had from an audience member was there is some new, I don't know if it was a clinical trial or if this was actually approved, but there's a new medication name being thrown out as a possible revelation in Parkinson's management called Vialev, coming out of Washington or Washington State.
Yes.
There was I guess a recent article that had come out and had been handed to one of our audience members, and supposed to be a really interesting.
What's the name of the medicine?
Vialev. So I have the spelling as Vyalev.
Young boy?
Oh, there's a new, so levodopa is the most effective medication for Parkinson's disease. As many people know, you take the medicine and then it leads to high levels in your blood that then drop off. And so people can get fluctuations in their symptoms. There's a new way of delivering this medication, which is much like an insulin pump, which gives you a relatively continuous level of insulin or insulin based on your blood sugar levels. This will give you a relatively constant level of levodopa, and it's under your skin. So it's a pump, an external pump that you wear that puts levodopa under your skin. And full disclosure, I've done consulting for companies that are developing this kind of therapy. I actually think it could be a major benefit for people with Parkinson's disease who have fluctuations in their symptoms. It's not a cure, it's just making levodopa so it's more effective, fewer fluctuations. So for the right individuals, I think it could be a substantial benefit. It has some problems, including skin reactions, as you can expect. But I think for the right individuals, it could be a major benefit.
There's a question about
Is it available now or
The
experimental?
FDA approved it literally, I think, 5 weeks ago. So I don't know, like, has it made its way to UCSD? I was actually just communicating with my colleague at the University of Rochester who would kind of oversee this. And he isn't sure if it's come in yet here. So I think it'll be coming soon. How about that?
Thank you.
Great question.
What kind of water filters do you recommend?
So I just use I get one from the grocery store. I think I have one from Pure, P-U-R. There's Pure or Brita. You can either just plop it in your pitcher. I have it tied to my faucet. So I just like literally push down a thing and the water it comes out, and I have municipal water, so it should be clean, but I don't believe it. Or I think it could be cleaner. And so I use that. And you have to replace the cartridge, every few months or so.
And the filter in your refrigerator, would that be the same type?
It should be. I've learned a lot more about water filters and dry cleaning than I ever thought I would. But so I'm not an expert in these things, but that would be my impression.
But carbon filter is basically what that is.
So it's a carbon filter that takes out a lot of these chemicals, including pesticides. And just a word, if you have a well, if any of you are getting well water, 1 in 8 Americans get their water from a well, usually on their property, you should have that tested, and I would 100% have a carbon filter on my water if I had a well.
Question here in the back, and I'll get to your question.
You must have grown up too on the Metropolitan Water District in Los Angeles, and the water was so chlorinated that you could smell it when it came. Is that a contributing factor too?
So I don't know, and that was actually an article just in Science Today. I only read the newspaper report. I didn't even read the article yet. Was that the chemicals used to decontaminate the water might have their own health risks. Again, why I would have a carbon filter.
Yeah, they changed to chloramine from chlorine, and
yes, exactly. And so chloramine was exactly what was reported today. Listen, if we want to, we're the wealthiest nation in the world by far. Shouldn't we be using some of that wealth to ensure that we have clean water, clean food, and clean air for all?
Yeah.
I mean, we spend $50 billion a year as a society for Parkinson's disease, $50 billion a year on Parkinson's disease. If we prevented 1% of Parkinson's disease, 1%, that would be an economic value of $500 million per year. That's more than the Michael J. Fox Foundation funds on Parkinson's research. That's more than the NIH spends on Parkinson's research. And half that money is paid for us through Medicare, through taxes. So if we want to live longer, healthier lives free of Parkinson's disease and save money, we can just invest in getting clean air, clean food, and clean water.
Some other questions over here.
You mentioned in your book about Pfizer dropping out of research for Parkinson's, but there were some small company spinoffs. What's been the trend since your first book on that?
So we've had no major therapeutic breakthroughs for Parkinson's this century. We've had no major therapeutic breakthroughs for Parkinson's disease this century. The treatments I prescribe to people like you with Parkinson's are exactly what my mentors prescribed before 2000. And it clearly begs the question, what are we doing wrong? I don't think we measure the disease really well. Many of you know that we measure the disease by having you tap your thumb and index finger. And people like me rate that on a subjective scale that goes from 0 to 4. And 0 is normal, and 4 is you can't do it. So in fact, everyone with Parkinson's is either a 1, 2, or 3. If we were trying to treat obesity and we measured people whether they were mildly obese, moderately obese, or severely obese, we wouldn't have very good treatments for obesity. When you have people get an objective measure like a scale, and you measure exactly how much they weigh, 138.4 pounds, you can tell in a short period of time whether a drug works or doesn't work, or an exercise intervention. And we just haven't done that for Parkinson's. Hopefully we're moving towards more objective measures of the disease, but I think we're spending a lot of time and energy trying to cure a preventable disease.
The trend with the pharmaceutical companies to spend more money on research?
So many of the major pharmaceutical companies are not active in Parkinson's because of these failures. If you just look, if you're a company and you keep failing in a particular disease area, you might look for greener areas or greener pastures. We need to come up with objective measures of the disease. When you have objective measures of the disease, many of you have friends with multiple sclerosis. MRI is a great objective measure of multiple sclerosis. And when I was in medical school, there was only one drug for multiple sclerosis. Now there's over 15. Morbidity and mortality due to multiple sclerosis is plummeting. So when you get objective measures of the disease, it's much easier to determine whether your treatments work or don't. So we greatly need those. Michael J. Fox Foundation, others are trying to come up with those.
You've talked a lot about how there are different causes, including like dry cleaning and environmental pollution and things of that nature. But when we start making those changes with someone who's had Parkinson's disease or hasn't had Parkinson's disease, has there been any research on like that contributing to a slower progression of Parkinson's or anything like that?
Yeah, so no one's doing that research really. Quite frankly, almost no one's doing research trying to prevent Parkinson's disease. If you look at every Parkinson's research dollar, only 2 cents, 2 pennies is spent on trying to prevent the disease. There are homes in Southern California that are sold for more money than we spend as a society on trying to prevent Parkinson's disease. There are homes that are being sold today in Southern California for more money than we spend as a nation on trying to prevent Parkinson's disease. There have been a couple studies that provide a couple clues. So, for example, high levels of air pollution are associated with increased risk of hospitalization among people with Parkinson's disease. I think it stands to reason that if the chemicals are causing the disease, the chemicals are only going to exacerbate the disease. I don't think that's a huge leap of faith. And so if I had the disease, I would avoid pesticides, I'd avoid air pollution, I'd avoid dry cleaning chemicals in all their forms. Yeah, I would just protect. You have 40% of your remaining nerve cells. I would protect them by exercising and avoiding toxicants in all forms.
Now, you just mentioned exercise, like we're in the kingdom of exercise right now. Obviously I'm a huge proponent of exercise and telling all of my clients exercise, and hopefully so are their doctors. What is your thought on intensity when it comes to exercise, and what do you tell your patients?
So it turns out you probably need to sweat. You make sure no one getting a heart attack. So assuming your doctor says you probably need to sweat. I tell people, I always tell if you're going to make me sweat as a doctor, I'm going to make you sweat as a patient. I tell them they should exercise at least an hour a day. And if I had Parkinson's, I'd exercise 2 hours a day. And I would just make it my number one priority. I just wouldn't wash, brush your teeth, go to the bathroom and exercise. I mean, that has to be every day because Parkinson's is a terrible disease and I don't want to get Parkinson's. I don't want my kids to get Parkinson's. You don't want your kids to get Parkinson's disease. I want this to be the last generation of Parkinson's disease. But if you have the disease, exercise is probably the most effective intervention next to levodopa and probably the intervention that has the best evidence for modifying the disease course.
Another question over here.
Did you want to go?
Sure. Can you speak to stem cell trials going on here in San Diego as well as at Lund University in Sweden?
Yes, the same question is also showing up in the chat about stem cell treatment.
So there were a large study about 20 years ago, modest size study looking at stem cells showing not to be beneficial. I think there's hope that stem cells might be of benefit when in clinical trials that need to be done to see if it is. Stem cells that you're just getting into your blood or injecting into your spinal fluid, I think are unlikely to be a benefit. And some of those procedures have their risks. So you can imagine injecting anything into your spinal fluid is asking for infection, inflammation, and lots of badness. But there are surgical studies that are looking to evaluate the efficacy of putting stem cells that can then generate dopamine producing nerve cells in the brain. Now, as you can imagine, getting those stem cells into the right part of the brain, getting those stem cells to develop into nerve cells that produce dopamine, getting those nerve cells that produce dopamine to make the connections to the right other parts of the brain that are necessary for functioning. Those are all huge things. There's huge risks with all this. But we talk about this in our book, A New Path for Prevention and Treatment. And I think there's hope there, but it's not like right around the corner.
There's another question in the chat, the thoughts on the sign 1 test, SYN.
Hold on.
Which I'm not aware of.
Say the name of the test again.
Sign or SYN 1 test.
Oh, so there are new markers of Parkinson's disease, one in your spinal fluid that Michael J. Fox found. That's part of PPMI. My colleague, Dr. Andrew Sidoroff, and his colleagues. And then there's skin biopsy tests that can now tell you with a pretty high degree of accuracy whether you indeed have Parkinson's disease or not. I think that could be a very powerful tool for the right individuals.
Question.
Same question that you just answered for stem cell. What about HGH?
Human growth hormone. I haven't seen much. As you can imagine, there's lots of people trying to develop treatments, so I'm not familiar with all of them. I haven't heard much.
Somebody mentioned that to me, and I went online, and there are apparently studies. So you specifically put in the HGH for Parkinson's, and then studies come up so that they had gone to the first phase, I guess it's called, and then are now working on the second phase. So I just found that interesting.
Yeah, so there's if you want to look at clinical trials, Michael J. Fox Foundation has a nice one called Trial Finder, which you can find clinical trials, and there's something called clinicaltrials.gov. It's an open database, and you can type in Parkinson's disease, and you can find clinical trials that are being done.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think I saw you.
Go ahead.
Okay. Getting back to what you were saying about exercising 1 to 2 hours a day and exercising to the intensity of sweating. With the idea of sweating, is there any benefit to taking saunas?
So can you sweat out these toxicants? We don't know. I don't think so. I think the exposures happened years ago. So I still wouldn't want you still getting exposed, but I think, just someone was mentioning, I forgot their husband or someone was working in dry cleaning. And so the exposures happened years ago and they're getting into the brain. So I think when they're being inhaled, for example, they're going in through the nerve responsible for smell, which hangs down into your nose and then making their way back into the brain. I think it's hard to get things out of the brain. That said, I wouldn't want to put anything more into the brain that's going to damage my nerve cells.
I have a more current question. For those people who have Parkinson's in their 60s, mostly 70s and older, recently, many people I know have had surgeries, emergency surgeries on colon, knees, or what effect could possibly the anesthesia have? Because we found that some people hadn't come back, and we're not sure why. How dangerous is it to have surgery with anesthesia in your 70s?
I just think we're just looking at these things entirely wrong. Everyone's trying to come up with a cure. I don't want to be cured of prostate cancer. I don't want to get prostate cancer. I don't want to need an artificial hip. That's why I exercise. I do all this stuff to prevent the needs for doing this. There are lots of people making lots of money by pushing lots of therapies on everyone. And I always say you want a doctor who's doing something for you instead of something to you. And there's lots of things that people are doing to people, and everything being done to people has risks. Everything. Whether it's levodopa, whether it's a knee replacement, all these things have risks. And the risks aren't just from anesthesia, which is, unlikely to make people's Parkinson's disease better, right? It's risk of complications. And all you hear about are cases that go well. No one talks about the cases that don't go well. And cases that really don't go well, you don't hear about because those people die. And so cemeteries are filled with mistakes that doctors have made and for procedures that people didn't need to have. So I get really, 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 really skeptical about the pushing of elective procedures onto people. I'm a neurologist, so I spend a lot of my time seeing what goes bad. So, I'm sitting on the other end and I give a biased sample and I have a biased view. But I think we should be spending a ton of time trying to get people healthy, investing in our children and stop exposing them to toxins so they stop getting cancer, so they can develop their IQs can be higher, and so that they need less need for these chemicals and these interventions at a later age. It's an ounce of prevention. Ben Franklin said it best: an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and we've completely neglected trying to prevent people from getting diseases. And the result is that 1 in 8 women get breast cancer, 1 in 8 men get prostate cancer, and lots of people spend their 60s and 70s going from doctor to doctor. And I think that needs to end.
We're probably going to wrap it up soon. There's a couple more questions I wanted to throw in there. So let's say, somebody in here is going to go see their neurologist, their movement disorder specialist. What are the top 3 questions they should be asking their doctor as a follow-up to today's session with you? And then, or what should their doctor be telling them that they're not?
I think the first question you should ask is, why do I have Parkinson's disease? And I'll give you reasons for that. If you don't know why you have Parkinson's disease, what's to say you're still not getting exposed to that chemical? Second, if we don't figure out what Parkinson's disease is causing it, how are we going to protect our kids and grandkids from getting the disease? And I think we have a moral obligation to prevent the disease in future generations, just like we live in a world that's free of polio, free of smallpox, free of typhus, free of yellow fever. that will likely one day be largely free of HIV. These are gifts we've received from previous generations. We have an obligation to receive gifts, and we have an obligation to reciprocate. And I think it's on us, all of you, on me especially, to create a world where Parkinson's disease is increasingly rare instead of increasingly common. And the only way we're going to do that is to figure out its causes. And then third, you guys want to have a cure. We have cured some diseases. We've cured hepatitis C. We have cured lots of infections we have cured. We cure peptic ulcer disease, bleeding ulcers. Some of you are old enough to remember bleeding ulcers being a major cause of death in the United States and around the world. When we figured out that peptic ulcer disease was due to a bacteria, when we figured out hepatitis C was due to a virus, we ended up developing treatments that have essentially cured peptic ulcer disease. Very few people die from bleeding ulcers in 2024 in the United States. And no one's dying of, very few people are dying of hepatitis C. And this is all things because once we figured out what the cause of disease is, we could put science to work and come up with ways to treat and cure this disease. So if you want to prevent the disease, if you want to slow its disease progression, if you want to prevent your children and grandchildren from getting the disease, ask why.
Question.
I was just wondering about the deep brain stimulation. Does he have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so for the right people, deep brain stimulation can be a highly effective treatment. The right people tend to be people under 75, relatively healthy, clearly have Parkinson's disease, clearly have benefit from levodopa, tend to get dyskinesias, extra movements, and tend to have fluctuations in their symptoms.
So we have about like two minutes left remaining. Any other closing questions or comments?
Have you figured out why Parkinson's is more common in men?
Yeah, so I think it has less to do with biology. So in the vast majority of the world, Parkinson's is more common than men, 40% more common, not just a little bit. I think it has to do with sociology. So in the United States, 75% of farmers are men, 97% of pesticide applicators are men, most mechanics are men. Dry cleaners happen to be, I think, women, but the vast majority of these professions that have high levels of exposure to these chemicals, miners, as someone was mentioning earlier, are men. It turns out in Japan and Taiwan, Parkinson's is equally common among men and women, and it turned out that most farmers in those countries used to be women. So I think we have another great clue to what's causing this disease.
We just found out recently a company that my husband used to work for that we're aware of at this point. There are 3 people out of 15 that used to work in that building at that company, probably 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah, and so we
just saw, 2 of them recently and had no idea that they had, and they didn't know Dan had it. And also in our neighborhood, I found that interesting that we live in a cul-de-sac of 19 people, 19 homes. And as far as we know, so far, Dan is number 3. There were 3 people on the cul-de-sac.
So many of you know that radon can evaporate from soil and come into people's homes and cause lung cancer. Trichloroethylene and perchloroethylene can evaporate from contaminated soil and water that can be a mile or more away from the contaminated site and enter people's homes, schools, and workplaces. People can breathe in these chemicals for years at work, at home, in school and never know about it, and then years later develop Parkinson's disease or cancer. We investigated a cluster of attorneys, much like you were saying. 4 of the 79 attorneys had Parkinson's disease, and 15 of them had a cancer related to the chemical. I think it's an untold story and a major reason why people are getting Parkinson's disease. We talked about the apartment buildings above dry cleaners. If we want to live long, healthy lives, we need clean air, clean food, and clean water, and that's universal. If we have those things, we can live longer, healthier lives. We can spend a lot less money on healthcare expenses. We can spend a lot less time with doctors and a lot more time with our loved ones.
Well, that's about all we have time for, but in working with as many people as I work with who have Parkinson's disease and their lovely families and their caregivers and all of the clinicians and the doctors, I just want to say thank you for sounding the alarm on such an incredibly important matter. The book that you've written, I'm hoping will change the future generations and decrease the incidence of Parkinson's disease. Any other comments?
I just want to thank the doctor and his team for dedicating their lives to improving our lives.
Yep.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm going to put it back to you. The people who changed the course of these diseases, and some of you remember polio, who changed the course of polio, who changed the course of drinking and driving, who changed the course of HIV, are those who are most directly affected by the disease. Michael J. Fox, Brian Grant says Parkinson's disease sucks. And you guys all know that Parkinson's disease sucks. And it's incumbent upon you as a community to find your voices and let our politicians and policymakers and our school boards know that this disease sucks and that we are tired of bearing the burden of this. And if we're going to bear the burden, we want to be the last generation to bear this burden. We're not passing this down to our children. We're not passing this down to our grandchildren. We're going to work for clean air, clean food, and clean water for everyone, everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wow. That was
Pretty
interesting.
incredible.
Yeah.
Do we get the book?
Yeah.